Hello, this is Ukrlife is Lyudmila Nemiri, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And today we have a very special guest, and our guest today is Dr. Andrew Michta. He is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council of the United States. Dr. Michta, hello, thank you so much to be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Doctor, you wrote two brilliant articles last days. First is Russia's imperial mindset, understanding the roots of the Ukrainian war. And the second one is why America abandoning Europe would be a strategic mistake. Let's back for the first article because it has become very popular and in Ukraine. And I wanted to talk today about some thoughts you expressed in this article. First of all, you say about the strategy. What do you think? What was the strategy of West and USA during these 3 years of big war? What was the advantages and what was the mistake?
Well, I would say, and with great regret, that there was clearly no strategy of victory. What you witnessed throughout the 3 years, on the one hand, was a very determined move by President Biden. I'm very proud that he led the West in responding to Russian aggression. So definitely a great accomplishment for Washington. But at the same time, what followed was more escalation management rather than a clear path to an end state in Ukraine. And most of all, that translated into how we administered economic and military assistance. You may remember, I think it was Chancellor Scholz of Germany who said Ukraine cannot lose, Russia cannot win. And I was always puzzled by that. What does that really mean? Right? To me, when you go to war, you apply as much power as you have to break the adversary and achieve the outcome you want at the lowest cost. You know, we don't want a protracted conflict. And that's why I was very concerned also when we started talking about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, because on the one hand, it expresses our solidarity with Ukraine, but at the same time, it's not focusing on what's important. What do the Ukrainians need to break the Russian military and achieve a strategic victory? Which I think was achievable, in my view, in 2022 during the first offensive, had we resourced Ukraine properly. Because at that time, if you remember, the Russians were disorganized. They had no logistics, no defenses, and no leadership. Whereas the Ukrainian military at that time was the most motivated. I called them diamonds. You know, these were the volunteers who were coming in. So where we ended up, I think, unfortunately, is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the numbers kick in. And unfortunately, in my assessment, Russia today has about 4 times the size of the population that Ukraine has. When you became independent in 91, correct me, Lyudmila, if I'm wrong, but I think Ukraine was about 52 million people. In 2022, after the loss of Crimea in 2014, and then some out-migration, when the Russians attacked again, you were about 40 million. So right now, I'm guessing here, there's no clear estimate, but just looking at the out-migration, you're probably between 25 and 30 million people. So the Russians have 1 to 4 population advantage. So if you continue to fight a war of attrition, you know how it ends. I mean, the numbers kick in. So we need a strategy, in my view, and we need to understand what it would take to actually have Russians negotiate in good faith. And if you look at how Putin behaved when the General Kellogg reached out, you know, to start negotiations, the Russians believe they're winning. So they're not interested in negotiations. And I think this will be the position that he will take so long as he believes he can win at an acceptable cost. And that's the key, acceptable cost to Putin. He is recruiting where? He's recruiting in Buryatia, he's recruiting in prisons, he's going to the provinces, pulling poor people into the military, you know, their family, when they get compensated for their death or injury, you know, for them, it's something very attractive. He had not been forced to recruit in Moscow and Petersburg, where the actual risk would reside for him. So because we were so concerned with escalation management, and because he skillfully threatened the use of nuclear weapons, Putin at every turn, as you remember, would say, if you cross this red line, I reserve the right, et cetera, et cetera. We have self-deterred in a way. So we are now at a critical moment in this war. And I think depending on what decisions the incoming administration will take, that will define the outcome.
Dr. Michta, you say that the strategy is the main thing, but you say that, let me quote you,
Okay.
that Western leaders continue to fail or refuse to understand the roots of the war, and that the Russia is the empire. And how West would formulate the working strategy in that case?
This is a great question, Ludmila. Let me explain what I meant in the article, and why your country is so important. So in a nutshell, I think it was Zbig Brzezinski who said when he was still alive that Russia without Ukraine cannot be an empire again. And Russia with Ukraine can only be an empire. Why am I quoting him? To me, we have consistently misunderstood the nature of Russian power because we apply our own criteria to Russia. I've worked with the Ukrainian military for about 7 years when I was in Germany, working for the Defense Department at the Marshall Center. And there were a couple of things I learned which were very important. That first of all, your country was very diverse. When I would visit Western Ukraine, you went to Volhynia, Halichina, that was very kind of Central European in feel, very Ukrainian, very patriotic. Kiev, like any capital, was a bit of this, a bit of that. The East tended to be post-Soviet. There was a lot of Russian-speaking people. But the invasion of Crimea unified that national identity. If you look at how Kharkiv was defending itself and the rest of it. And my point was that to be a democracy, to have any sort of pluralist form of government, any polyarchic form of government, that only can grow for a sense of national community, that you have some sense of responsibility to each other as citizens. Well, Russia doesn't have that because there's no such thing in that state in the Russian Federation. And I don't mean just, how many so-called nationalities, as the Russians call them, are part of that, but it's the form of governance. It's the relationship between the center of power and people who are below that. Unfortunately, we tend to mirror image in the West. We tend to think because most of the people, when they say they know Russia, they've traveled to Moscow or Petersburg or maybe some other major city. Policy elites, when they talk about Russian culture, they think Chekhov, Dostoevsky, ballet, and all that very accomplished but thin veneer of elite culture. They don't have an understanding of how the Russian politics work and what Russian history really is. I think one of the reasons for this in the United States is that by and large, with very few exceptions, Russian area studies or Soviet area studies during the Cold War were created by Russian emigres. There were very few exceptions. So they brought with them the assumptions. It's only Tim Snyder that started talking about, no, wait a minute, there are other nations there, when he started talking about bloodlands in Ukraine. So the Eurasian studies are beginning to develop, East European studies. And so we have assumed that somehow we can get back to the status quo without understanding what Putin was doing. And here's what I believe is happening. He is relitigating the end of the Cold War. He is relitigating the settlement. He wants to revise the settlement that emerged at the end of the Cold War. And if you compare this to a history of other empires, I wrote about it in several places, that in 1918, when Imperial Germany lost the First World War and the Weimar Republic was created, the narrative was what? The Germans called it Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back. The narrative was the Great Reichswehr never lost a battle. It was betrayed by the politicians, the cowards, and that gave them Hitler, gave them another bid for empire. And it wasn't only until that Imperial Germany was defeated, I mean, in the most brutal, complete sense, it was partitioned, you know, that imperial narrative was broken. I bring this up because to me, the 90s in Russia was the Russian Weimar. It was the era in which the Russians experimented with democracy. But the narrative from the nationalists that was coming in, and from the imperialists especially, was, look, we were never defeated. The great Soviet army was never defeated. We were betrayed by cowardly Gorbachev, drunken Yeltsin, you know, and the West most of all. And that gave them Putin. And Putin's narrative to his followers, and unfortunately to the majority of the Russian population, is, I will restore this Veliki Ruski Mir. I will give you your glory back. Why am I saying this? I believe that Russia will remain a chronic threat as long as it is an imperial power like it is. And that the only way to break that narrative is for Russia to suffer a defeat on the battlefield. Nobody in the West has any sort of desire to go to war with Russia. That's not what I'm advocating. But what I'm saying is the Ukrainians, if they had defeated the Russian military in Ukraine, they would have broken that imperial narrative that we're still a great imperial power. And remember, Ludmila, if you look historically at the Russian imperial evolution, every time they lose a war in foreign soil, they fracture, right? It's the Crimean War in the 19th century, and it's the Russo-Japanese War. It's the First World War, gave them two revolutions, right? Gave them a civil war. And more recently, they lost in Afghanistan, pulled out in 1989. By 1991, there was no Soviet empire. So my point is, the West should not be having a conversation so much about the end states in Ukraine, but really, what is the end state we want in Eurasia? And what kind of a Russian state emerging from all of this could actually stop being a threat? I call the war your country is fighting a system transforming war, because no matter what happens, win, lose, or draw, and I'm wishing, as you know, Ukrainians all the best, but it may be, you may either prevail or you may fail. I mean, you know how it is in international affairs. No matter what happens, the world will not be the same, but too few people among Western leadership are willing to admit and accept that new reality. The Russians have consistently used military power to score geopolitical wins, while Western leaders sat around and talked about norms and rules. And he invaded Georgia. What happened to him? Virtually nothing. He got Nord Stream 1 completed. He invaded Crimea, took parts of your territory, started a war in Donbass and in Luhansk. What happened to him? Nothing. He got Nord Stream 2. He attacked, you know, he butchered Syrians at Aleppo. Slap on the wrist. So we need to rethink about how we are actually going to proceed, whether there is such a thing as going back to business as usual or not. So in a sense, we're having a conversation about ourselves, I think. And remember, if we lose credibility in Eastern Europe, the Chinese are watching this. This is not just Russia fighting. He is not fighting your country per se. He's killing your people, destroying your cities, but he's fighting the collective West. I watch a lot of Russian media. I'm sure you know how Russian propaganda rolls. He is fighting. We may say NATO is not at war with him, but he tells his people that he's at war with America, with NATO, with the West. So if he wins in Ukraine, he scores a geopolitical win, a civilizational win. And the Chinese are watching this saying, okay, does the West have the staying power? The North Koreans are part of this alliance. The Iranians, I mean, the fact that you have North Korean soldiers fighting in a European theater, that's preposterous to me. That means that unless we restore deterrence in a credible way, this thing will continue to escalate and regional balances will become more and more fragile.
In your article, you say that Russia can be blocked and contained, as it was during the half century of the Cold War. How Russia can be contained today? Because when you use the example of Cold War, it was a little bit another world.
Sure.
We have two camps, and to have a balance among these two camps. But now it seems to me, absolutely another situation. As you say in your next article, it's a time of fundamental rethinking of foreign policy. You say that about USA, but I say that it's much more broader.
Sure.
And how it is possible to do this in such, a world that is dramatically changed? Is it possible, and how it could be possible?
I think it's very much possible. Well, a couple of things. To some extent, what's really ironic, Ludmila, is that the Russian Federation is just a pale shadow of what the Soviet Union was. So paradoxically, Russian weakness is what, I mean, if you look at the Russian GDP and compare it to the combined GDP of the European Union or European Union and the United States, or all of European countries in the United States, throw even the Chinese GDP into this. This shouldn't be a conversation. Russia's got about 140 million people. That's half the population of the USSR. Russia during the Cold War was sitting in the middle of Germany, had over 50 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions at its disposal. China was nothing, was a pale shadow. So paradoxically, that relative and absolute Russian strength really focused attention in the West. And regardless of where you were on the map, if you were in Western Germany, which was the critical point of contact, or in France, or in the UK, or in Spain, you were under the same threat. And everybody knew if there is a war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, you're in it regardless. Even the so-called neutrals understood that. The Swedes and the Finns knew this very well, that they wouldn't be spared. Well, today, it depends on where you sit on the map, Ludmila. When I'm in Helsinki or in Tallinn or in Vilnius, or in Warsaw or Bucharest, it's all Russia. They understand it. They understand the threat because they're next door. And if you're a Baltic state, you lose the war. It's an existential loss. You may disappear as not just as a state, but as a people, right? Well, if you're in Berlin, you're no longer a frontier country in Germany. You've got buffers. The Germans tried for 20 years to manage this relationship through political and economic means, making Russia, involved, if you will, in commerce and energy, and making themselves, unfortunately, in the process, excessively dependent on Russian gas. Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, these were strictly political projects for the Russians, regardless of all the nonsense you heard out there. This is just business. If you're in Paris, when I visit Europe and I'm in Paris, I talk to the military or political leaders, France has real interest in the Mediterranean and in Northern Africa and in MENA, right? In the Sahel. And if you get even farther out, you go into Spain and Portugal. My point is, the reason why it's so hard to come up with a coherent plan against a relatively weak opponent is because the threat perceptions and security optics are divided. They're literally where you sit on the map defines of how you look at the world. So what we need to change this is we need American leadership, because in the final analysis, NATO is an organization where the US is this primus inter pares. The US brings nuclear umbrella to Europe. It brings the high-end enablers, technological capabilities. And especially now, Europe is so disarmed after this. You have the strongest army in Europe right now, Ludmila. That tells you everything you need to know. I remember when I worked in Germany, I just came back to Washington after 7 years working in Germany for the Defense Department and the Marshall Center. The Bundeswehr is a pale shadow of what it used to be. There are no tanks, there's no munitions, there's no stocks. When I saw at the rates of consumption when you were fighting the Russians in the second offensive, what you were firing in a day, or 3 days was what we produced in a month at that time. It's a completely separate conversation, but Russia is on a wartime footing, Europe is not. And if it were not for the United States with our supplies and our stocks, there would be no way to supply you. So if there is political leadership and a clearly articulated strategy, this is absolutely achievable. Europe is 500 million people, roughly, okay? The GDP that's orders of magnitude bigger than anything Russia can have. The only reason Russia is surviving is because the Chinese are backfilling them, buying their energy, and because they're, violating all the sanctions. Look at their shadow fleet. Look at that. They continue to sell energy. They continue to cheat. They continue to get supplies. And, but if the Europeans got serious about rearmament, and created the core of conventional forces. I mean, I cannot imagine that Russia would even dare to cross the border. And most importantly, what happens in your country is key, because as you know, I've been writing since day one that Ukraine should be a NATO member. When Brussels and Berlin started talking about bringing you into the EU, I thought that was quite frankly, a secondary conversation, and it was to kind of appease the Ukrainians for not offering you NATO membership. Why am I saying this? Can you imagine anybody rebuilding your country, any private equity going in, money to reconstruct Ukraine, when you're constantly under threat of attack? There's no way you can rebuild Ukraine until you address the security equation, right? No red cent of private equity will go into Ukraine at that level of risk. And the reason I said, NATO membership, again, it's not because I like Ukrainians or don't like Ukrainians. It's because it's the simplest, most cost-effective way that secures Ukraine and at the same time contributes to NATO. There are 3 countries right now that have on the flank, that have the population resources and terrain to build the conventional capabilities to provide the core of deterrence against Russia. The Americans providing nuclear umbrella, high-end enablers, our own contingents. That's Ukraine, Romania, and Poland. And I called you once the best NATO ally that is not in NATO, because what you're doing is you're degrading and fighting the Russian military, and it's not even on NATO territory because you haven't brought in. So I've written and argued that you should be in NATO. Unfortunately, I don't think at this stage in the game, because of our lack of strategy, that's going to happen. We could go back to 2008. I think the consequences of the horror your country is living through today go back to that fateful decision of getting Berlin and Paris blocking, George W. Bush's push for NATO membership for Ukraine. The only thing that really deters Putin is the NATO alliance in the final analysis. So if you can't go in, at least in any time soon, then what really matters is, first of all, how do you get Putin to negotiate in good faith? Number one. I cannot imagine any government in Ukraine recognizing the territorial losses. This is your land. I was laughing recently. I was talking to a French colleague. I said, it's very easy, because a lot of Western analysts talk about giving away land for peace, blah, blah. I said, it's very easy to give away somebody else's territory, How about we talk about Alsace-Lorraine and maybe some other parts? So no, this is your land. The Russians violated your territory. But the question is, how do you bring him to the negotiating table for real? And I would argue, to do this, we probably have to escalate the conflict. There are 3 components to your war, in my view. One is the people. And I remember just before the war started, I was still in Germany. That army that fought in the first, campaign and the first counteroffensive, that was the most highly motivated, the strongest morale. These were the diamonds. These were volunteers going in. Unfortunately, that army was largely attrited. But so that you've got the morale is declining. I mean, it pains me when I'm in Europe to see a lot of young Ukrainian men driving in expensive cars with Ukrainian license plates. That tells you a lot about what is happening. But it's also because for 3 years of this, I mean, every nation has a breaking point. People get exhausted if you're not rotated from the front line. So that's the people piece. The second is equipment. And in the West, we have been so preoccupied with talking about, what we give the Ukrainians, when we give it to the Ukrainians. Do we give them, remember, first javelins, then it was HIMARS, then it was ATACMS, then it was F-6. All of this to me is secondary, because weapons and munitions are the tools you put against the strategy. So what's missing is the third component, which is a workable strategy for victory. And what I mean at this stage, I think, is getting the Russians to a point where they realize they cannot win at an acceptable cost. And I have advocated for lifting restrictions on what you can hit. I mean, he is destroying your country, literally. He's attacking civilian targets. He's killing your people. And yet you're constantly being, kind of constrained in how you can respond, because he pulls out the nuclear weapon threat immediately. and that deters then a lot of response from the West. So we need a strategy of how we go about to get him to really negotiate. And then most importantly, and that'll be my last point, what happens after? Because the deal itself, we will congratulate ourselves. Let's say that there's some equitable negotiated settlement, because right now accepting Putin's terms, that's Ukraine's defeat and Russian victory. And that's a defeat for the West, because he's not fighting just Ukraine, he's fighting the West. But let's say that we get to a rough deal that we can live with. How do we enforce it? And here the question is, will there be sufficient commitment from the US and Europe and other allies to provide Ukraine with weapons, munitions, economic assistance, and the rest of it, to make sure you remain sovereign, independent, and can rebuild? Kind of a Korean situation, if you will, so that the Russians don't dare attack. And that is the most important part of the conversation.
Dr. Michta, and one last question, if you have 2 minutes here. You say about Russia as a threat, but you know that now we saw the kind of coalition among South Korea, maybe China, I don't know, and Iran, Russia. Do you think that this matter for situation around the war?
Absolutely. Look, I call them the axis of dictatorships. It's Russia. Some people call them the axis of aggressors. I think their political systems matter. These are all, authoritarian, dictatorial, totalitarian states. They're united in their common opposition. The North Koreans and the Iranians are more regional players, but they're enabling Russia and they're enabling China to a large extent, but mainly Russia right now. China is the sponsor of Russia. China, in 2022, when the war started, the Russians increased their sales of black coal by 20-some% to China. They doubled their pipeline gas sales and their LNG sales and the rest of it. So that's an interesting separate question, to what extent the Russians want to become vassalized vis-a-vis the Chinese. But the important thing is this. We need to understand that this is a conflict for the future of Europe and Eurasia, what the security architecture will look like. The United States went to war in the 20th century twice, in the First War and the Second War, to prevent one power from dominating Europe and Eurasia, because that would lock us into our hemisphere and deprive us of our access of freedom of navigation, access to resources, and the rest of it. And then would allow our adversaries to attack us directly in our homeland. And then after the Second World War, so the first time it was the German imperial bid, then it was the Nazi Germany imperial bid. And then we realized at the end of the Second World War that our ally from that Second World War was poised to do exactly what the Germans failed to do, because Germany was defeated, Europe was destroyed, and the Soviets had tanks that were standing right there. So what did we do? We stayed in Europe and we contained the Russians until the Russians finally imploded. Why? Once again, to deny them control over Europe and Eurasia. We're now in a, I would argue, worse situation than before, because we're not dealing with one power, we're dealing with an axis of states. And so what we need to do, because the US is looking at threats in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Chinese are bidding for regional hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. They're building their navy at a rate that one analyst estimates is in effect the equivalent of an entire British navy every 4 years. Numerically, they have the largest navy in the world today. They're not very capable ships, but they are still operating close to shore. The Russians are reconstituting their military at a much faster rate than people thought, because you lack the technological capability in Ukraine to really attack their air power and to attack their navy to on a scale that would have to happen. It's really the land forces in Russia that have been really badly damaged, but they're reconstituting armor very quickly. They're pulling all equipment from storage, the T-72s, even the older crap, and they're rebuilding some of the stuff. So they're putting over 1,000 tanks into service every year. And the Russians fight a war that relies on mass. That's what they've always done. All the talk about Serdyukov's reforms, remember, battalion tactical groups and all that nonsense, that's gone. This is attrition, mass, meat grinder people. They've done this for centuries. So if we do not rearm, because the United States is being challenged in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. Now we also have a hot war in the Middle East. This front is extending. The 4 states started it in Ukraine, extended to the Middle East. I think the Korean Peninsula may be next because the 2018 agreements have been eliminated, and then the Indo-Pacific itself. And that pulls US resources. So what we need from Europe, that's why I keep coming back to your country. You have the largest conventional force in Europe. You're battle tested. You're determined to defend your nation. You belong in the alliance. I mean, it's to me, it's a very straightforward, simple proposition. But there's no consensus in the alliance to bring you in. You remember what happened in Vilnius, what happened in Washington. You know, we keep talking about the bridge to NATO. We keep talking about eventually someday. And I think it's because we have missed this historic opportunity. So Europe must rearm. I think Europe must take, especially European NATO allies, take on the bulk of conventional deterrence, because we will be tested, I think, in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, you know, I have yet to hear of a strategy that, other than talking in reactive terms, I'm talking now not about your country, but in general, what's happening in the West. We talk about defending rules-based international order. I don't want to be defending anything. I want the dictators to be defending themselves. I want to be shaping the world that favors freedom, democracy, you know, our aspirations to live in an open system. So I keep asking, what does this victory look like? Not in normative terms, you know, democracy, freedom. That's fine, and it's important. What is the map supposed to look like? Which are the critical theaters we have to hold? What are our key allies? You know, and that in your region, it brings us to this conversation. Last point, we got so used to think in terms of polarities because we lived in this bipolar system during the Cold War that we seem unable to understand what's really happening in the world. I would argue we're not so much in a multipolar world as people like to say, because multipolarity is just kind of a statement, but it doesn't allow you to structure your strategy. You say there are many states, well, big deal, many powers. I think what we see is we are in the midst of a very protracted systemic instability worldwide. Why? Because different regional balances are unraveling. You know, Ukraine is either we restore the balance of power in Europe or we will not. You know, we'll have a wider conflict. The Middle East, same thing. Korea is going to be the same thing. And then the Indo-Pacific. And I will conclude on this. I've always told my students that the Second World War didn't start because Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland. It started because before that, regional balances were breaking down. You had the Civil War in Spain. You had the Manchuria, you know, the Japanese invasion in Asia. You had the dismemberment of Austria and Czechoslovakia. And then all of this collapsed, you know, in that final battle. I am very, very concerned that if Ukraine is defeated, 2 things will happen. Putin will not stop, even if there's some sort of an agreement. He wants to either take you over or to destroy you. And, you know, I don't think he has any interest in rebuilding Ukraine. And the second thing is, if Ukraine fails, he will force your young men into his security apparatus. Some people will leave. Some people will continue to resist, obviously. But by and large, he will control Ukraine and its resources, its terrain, its food, its industry, its everything. And I find it really stunning that it's so difficult for a lot of people who talk about strategy in the West to understand what an apocalyptic consequence of that we would have to deal with. The defeat in Ukraine, to me, would make, you know, Afghanistan look like a minor operation because it's the critical theater. And I'm coming back to what we started with. If Russia doesn't have Ukraine, if you rebuild yourself and thrive as a democracy, I am convinced that Belarus will also change course. There's no way that those young men and women who were beaten into a pulp, when Lukashenko stole the election. And I visited Minsk on several occasions, so I have a pretty good sense of what's going on there, I think. They will not accept that status. Your pull will be very strong. That's why Putin is so intent on turning you into another Belarus, controlling your military, controlling your state and your politics.
Dr. Michta, thank you so much to be with us today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.